Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Welcome to the evolving coronavirus situation in Israel. So my name is Ben Stone. I was, a senior at Duke University, and I am the CAMERA Fellow there. So CAMERA is a great fellowship. I really had a lot of fun this year. It not only allowed me to learn about current events regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also forced me to think critically about it, because the main part of the fellowship is writing accurate articles. And so I really had to go out, do the research, and write articles without a bias. So if any of you guys have questions regarding CAMERA on campus, please reach out to me or anyone else on the call or on the CAMERA website. So I'd like to welcome our special guest, Mr. Sean Durns. So Sean Durns is a senior research analyst for CAMERA in our Washington, D.C. office. Before coming to CAMERA, he worked in a lot of think tanks and for a high-ranking Pentagon official. His background is in the study of terrorism and political violence. And his articles will regularly appear in a lot of media outlets, including the Washington Times, the Washington Examiner, Jerusalem Post, and the Washington Jewish Week. So this event is mostly going to be Sean talking about the coronavirus situation in Israel, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. So you guys can post all your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll come to them after, okay? So whenever you come up with one, just post it in the Q&A box in the bottom. So now I'm gonna leave it to Sean to take it away.
Thank you very much, Ben. As Ben mentioned, I'm Sean Durns, and I'm gonna be discussing Israel's response to the coronavirus. I'd like to begin with a brief timeline so we can kind of understand how things are today and what the situation is in Israel today regarding the coronavirus. So the coronavirus initially appeared as early as November in Wuhan province in China. As late as mid-January, the World Health Organization was echoing claims by the Chinese government that the virus wasn't transferable from humans. On January 26, Israel advised against non-essential travel to China. By January 30th, Israel suspended all flights to China. On February 17th, Israel extended a ban to include arrivals from Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore, and elsewhere in East Asia. On February 21st, a female citizen tested positive after being on a cruise ship. In response, a 14-day home isolation rule was instituted for anyone who had visited South Korea or Japan. And a ban was placed on non-residents and non-citizens who were in South Korea for 14 days before their arrival. On February 26, Israel issued a travel warning to Italy. And on February 27th, a man returning from Italy who had been in country for 4 days tested positive, as did several members of his family and his employees at his shop. As a response to that, border control measures were extended to Italy as well. On March 2nd, Israeli elections were held. More than 4,000 Israelis voted in special quarantine booths. On March 9th, Israel declared a mandatory quarantine for all citizens and for foreigners, the latter taking effect on March 13th. On March 11th, Israel limited gatherings to 100 people. March 12th, schools and universities were closed until Passover. This was later extended. March 15th, Israel's justice minister announced that non-urgent business before the courts would be frozen. That same day, gatherings were further limited to 10 people, and people were advised to keep a distance of 6 feet between each other. Health Ministry also issued guidelines, which at this point I think most people here in the US would be familiar with. March 19th, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared a national state of emergency, saying that existing restrictions would henceforth be legally enforceable and violators would be fined. March 20th, Israel experienced its first coronavirus death. More restrictions were put into place and the lockdown tightened. On April 2nd, Bnei Brak became the first area to be declared a restricted zone, following the Israeli government approval of new regulations to allow closure on areas identified as coronavirus hotspots. On April 7, 2020, Israel's health minister announced that he had tested positive. During Passover, Israel imposed a travel curfew that banned intercity travel and mandated that individuals would go no further than 100 meters from their home. By April 12th, wearing masks was made mandatory. On April 20th, Israel agreed to form a new government with Netanyahu and Gantz cutting a deal. I'll talk more about that later if you guys have any questions about that. On April 21st, Israel announced that 33 Israelis have been treated with antibodies from those who had coronavirus, with authorities saying that they were cautiously optimistic about the results. That number has since grown. On April 26th, some lockdown measures were eased. By April 30th, the number of recoveries surpassed the number of active cases. As a response, Israel lifted some further restrictions, including those on outdoor sports. By May 1st, some measures of limited reopening were announced in Israel. On May 3rd, beaches were reopened for sports such as swimming and surfing. May 4th, the opening of malls and gyms was presented as an offer to the government, but will only be implemented in the following week, and that's been the case. So that's kind of where things stand today. And I can talk further about travel restrictions, public transport issues, if anyone has any questions later. So as elsewhere, Israel's economy has been dramatically impacted by the coronavirus. Initially, private sector firms exceeding 10 employees were required to reduce staff presence in the workplace by 70%. Unemployment has risen dramatically, with some estimates indicating nearly 30% unemployment. For comparison's sake, 5 weeks ago was 16%. Israel's much lauded tech sector has provided a level of flexibility for both its citizens and its economy. More people and businesses are able to work remotely. But other key industries, notably Israel's important tourism component, has been dramatically impacted. There's no way to mince words here. 30% unemployment is disastrous. In February, for comparison, the unemployment rate was 3.4%. So that's very worrisome. Other reasons for concern, which I kind of went over in my last talk several weeks ago about the situation in Israel. Israel's taken drastic actions, and for good reason. The country was, and still is to some extent, I would argue, in a precarious position for reasons relating to geography, size, and culture. As I noted before in my last talk, Israel is a small country. It's the size of New Jersey. Many portions of the country are densely populated. Second reason, geography. Israel is surrounded by countries, failed states, and polities ruled by non-state actors such as Hamas and Gaza, and terrorist groups that, suffice to say, don't prioritize the health and well-being of their citizens whatsoever. So that presents a problem for Israel in terms of border controls and controlling the spread of the coronavirus. However, Israel is actively cooperating with the Palestinian Authority, the entity that rules the West Bank, and they both seem to recognize, both the PA and Israel, a shared interest and objective in terms of reducing the spread of coronavirus, which of course does not recognize borders and barriers of that nature. To date, Israel has delivered thousands of medical kits and supplies, including coronavirus tests, as well as protective gear to the Palestinian Authority. And indeed, Israel and the PA have established a joint operations room to combat the virus. That has been in effect since mid-March. Israel has also offered medical training and supplies to Palestinians living in Hamas-ruled Gaza. As one unnamed Palestinian Authority official told the Jerusalem Post, anyone who opposes cooperation with Israel in the medical field would be acting against the interests of our people. This is the time to lay aside our differences and work together against the pandemic, which does not distinguish between a Jew or an Arab. In addition, Magan David and Sheba Medical Center in Tel HaShomer held training courses for Palestinian medical teams on how to protect themselves and their patients from the coronavirus. 2 Palestinian laboratory technicians were trained at Tel HaShomer at a training session that was held in a hospital in Jericho. In addition to facilitating donations from the international community, Israel has also provided the Palestinians with, and this number has gone up, I should note, with 1,950 coronavirus testing kits and 2,400 swabs for testing. Israel has also coordinated with the PA when its residences located in Israel were found to have coronavirus, enacting a back-to-back protocol for the patients to go from Israel to Palestinian ambulances. In addition, Israeli authorities notified the PA when Palestinians entered through Ben Gurion Airport or the Allenby crossing from Jordan so that the PA could make sure that they were quarantined. Palestinians with chronic illnesses continue to be allowed into Israel for life-saving treatment, and dozens of buses enter each day for that purpose. Dozens have also been allowed into Israel for life-saving treatments that are not available locally, but the number of requests has dramatically declined from what it was before the coronavirus. From March 10th to April 30th this year, only 350 Gazans asked to enter Israel for medical care, whereas last year that number was 4,025 during the same time period. The cooperation between Israel and the PA has been so extensive that even the UN has called it excellent cooperation, quote. And this is the UN, of course, that we're talking about. They're not generally favorably disposed towards Israel. Finally, I should note that per the terms of the Oslo II agreement, the Palestinian Authority is itself responsible for the medical needs of those residing under its rule, which includes the vast majority of Palestinians. As I noted in my previous webinar, another reason for Israel's concerns and forceful reaction are demographics and culture. According to one 2015 study, an estimated 11% of Israelis are 65 or older. This is not an insignificant amount, but it is slightly less than the United States, and it's nearly half of some places in Europe like Italy. That bodes well for Israel, and I think has a lot to do with why Israel has been so successful in its response. Now, the downside is that an estimated 25% of Israeli homes have an elderly member or a family member that is cohabitating. So this isn't unusual for the region, but compared to the United States and some countries in Western Europe, it's much, much higher. Given that the virus is easily transferable, including from the young and non-symptomatic, this is a significant hurdle for Israel to cross and has proven to be a problem. From the beginning, Israel has reacted much more forcefully as a result than many other countries. As I noted in the timeline earlier, they've quickly initiated border controls and quarantines. Unfortunately, and this is where CAMERA's work comes in, Israel's sizable donations to the Palestinian Authority and their establishment of a joint operations room and training for Palestinian medical personnel have been ignored by most major U.S. news outlets. This is where CAMERA's work, fact-checking and serving as a source for factual information at a time of international crisis becomes vital. The Washington Post, for example, and other major U.S. news outlets failed entirely to cover Israel's aid to the Palestinian Authority in initial reports on the coronavirus. Instead, many news outlets have taken narrative-based reporting to the next level, with op-eds appearing in the Atlantic, the Post, and elsewhere that absurdly have called Israel a dictatorship, and the first coronavirus dictatorship, as one commentator put it. Perhaps most disturbingly, some have used the COVID-19 crisis for their own ends, with Rep. Rashida Tlaib using it as an excuse to lobby for funding for UNRWA in the pages of the Washington Post over the weekend. Even more disturbingly, Foreign Policy magazine carried a piece arguing for Israel to allow the Palestinian Authority to continue to pay terrorists. They cited coronavirus as a reason, which is, suffice to say, that's quite disgusting. Old and inaccurate talking points have also reemerged, issues that CAMERA's dealt with for years, such as Israel's blockade of Gaza. Media reports have failed to note that Israel, in fact, allows medical and other essential goods into Gaza, and that the blockade itself was initiated as a response to Palestinian terrorist attacks. But of course, media outlets have not, generally speaking, noted that. We've gotten some corrections, however, at both the Associated Press and the Washington Post in recent weeks, so that way they can better inform their readers. In March 20, this last month there, CAMERA obtained a record amount of corrections, which is quite impressive. I'd like to finish with a reassessment in terms of where we are today and what has really changed since my last talk regarding the coronavirus situation in Israel. I noted that in my last talk that Israel was in a precarious position, but Israel's sense of shared sacrifice, an occurrence made easier by a shared history and requirements for mandatory service, have helped to reduce the spread. Israel, like the rest of the world, now has a better understanding of the coronavirus, and this is not, of course, an insignificant thing. And Israeli ingenuity and technology has provided an ability to track and monitor the virus and to pioneer efforts to combat it. On May 4th, Israel's Institute for Biological Research announced that it had completed a groundbreaking scientific development, determining an antibody that neutralizes the coronavirus, according to a statement by Israel's Defense Ministry. This scientific breakthrough has three key parameters, which is that the antibody is monocular, new and refined, and contains an exceptionally low proportion of harmful proteins. The Institute has demonstrated the ability of the antibody to neutralize the coronavirus, and the antibody was specifically tested on aggressive coronavirus patients. And the Defense Ministry said in an assessment, based on comprehensive scientific publications from around the globe, it appears that the Israeli Institute for Biological Research is the first institution to achieve a scientific breakthrough that meets all three of the aforementioned parameters. IIBR is now working to patent its antibody and secure contact for its commercial development. All legal procedures will be coordinated with the Defense Ministry for that. And Defense Minister Naftali Bennett, after visiting the lab, said that Jewish creativity and ingenuity brought about this amazing achievement. Indeed, Israel's government has pledged $60 million towards a coronavirus vaccine, and various Israeli institutions have been making progress on developing that vaccine. The Galilee Research Institute, for example, is reportedly in the final stages of developing its vaccine, and IIBR, as I noted, has gone quite far with their own tests. On April 19th, Tel Aviv University professor Jonathan Gershoni obtained a patent from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office for a COVID-19 vaccine. And at the time, of course, quite some time has passed since then, he estimated that he was 2/3 of the way towards completing it. Israeli deaths and hospitalization rates have also been far below what they're initially predicted to be. Indeed, despite the coronavirus, the month of March saw a 12% drop in the number of deaths compared to last year, and a 5% drop compared to the average monthly rate for the past decade. However, I should note, while that sounds quite optimistic, doctors expect that to eventually reverse. In many respects, Israel has been a model for containment and management of COVID-19. Indeed, Israel is part of an informal group known as the First Mover Nations, which have done relatively well suppressing COVID-19, which includes Israel, Austria, Denmark, Czech Republic, New Zealand, and Greece. Indeed, Israel's coronavirus figures are much less severe than countries of comparable size, including countries that impose stay-at-home orders relatively early in their outbreak. Sweden, for example, which shows a radically less interventionist approach, has about 10 times as many deaths as Israel, in a population only slightly larger than Israel's. Belgium, with a population of 11 million, Israel has a little more than 8, has over 7,500 fatalities, 34 times as many as Israel. Britain, with a population 6 times Israel's, has buried 26,000 victims, which is quite tragic. Israel is now in a position that many other countries find themselves, and I think this is where things stand today in Israel, which is balancing between reopening the economy and an economic recovery that, as I noted before, is really needed. 30% unemployment is, there's no way to positively spin that. That's very, very awful. But they're trying to balance economic recovery with preventing another growth in the spread of the virus. So, of course, this is where several countries are also finding themselves today, and it's where other countries will soon find themselves. Indeed, on May 4th, the government stipulated that if the number of new cases per day reaches 100 or more, or there are more than 250 patients in serious conditions, restrictions will be reimposed. So that's where things stand today. I think that one quote that comes to mind, in 1942, Winston Churchill famously said, "Now this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." So I think that's where we're at in Israel. I think we're at the end of the beginning of phase 1. And compared to how things initially seemed in terms of very dire predictions with fatality rates and whatnot, I think Israel has reason to be optimistic and both proud of its response. And that's it. Take any questions.
Okay. So far we have 3 questions. Feel free to come up with more as we ask them. I'll also ask a question later. So the first one is from Julian Snyder. So it's, do we know when Israel might reopen to international travel?
That's a great question, Julian. I'm kind of keeping an eye on that myself. Had some trips planned. We don't. As far as international travel goes, I would expect that restrictions would be kept in place for quite a bit of time. I don't think that there's going to be, first you'll see a lessening of restrictions on public transport. That's going to be coming in these next couple weeks to include railway systems. I think we're going to be a little ways away, and that Israel will, of course, have to look at what countries people are going to be visiting from and all sorts of other things. So I think it's still a little early to tell.
Mm-hmm. The next one is anonymous, but it is, what is the update on the current vaccine that has been discovered by Israel? And do you think that we will see it worldwide? And if we do, what would the timeline on that be?
That's a great question. It's a little bit beyond my capacity and background to answer, but I think that right now it seems like there are several promising vaccines that are in the works. More than 20 is my understanding that are being worked on internationally, and many of those are in Israel at IIBR and Tel Aviv and elsewhere. But I think that we're still a ways away because, of course, the real issue there is even once you get a vaccine is just the production and ramping up production. And that in itself is no easy task. So I couldn't give an exact timeline. That's not really my background, but I would imagine that regardless of where the vaccine is developed, that we're still looking at a ways till we get it manufactured in mass.
Mm-hmm. So someone asked a question relating to that. Basically, it was about the monoclonal antibody breakthrough that you talked about. Are there any international partnerships in the works with Israel at the universities?
That I don't know. I would hedge bets, yes. Yes, that there are. The thing, of course, about many Israeli universities, Tel Aviv U, Hebrew U, and many others, Technion, of course, is that they have extensive partnerships. And Israel is a world leader in research and development in just about every category. So I think that partnerships, of course, are going to be crucial. There seems to be a large shared recognition amongst many countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now we're getting a lot more questions. So this one is, Ariel Gold has tweeted constantly regarding Gaza and the coronavirus. And by the way she makes it sound, Gaza is suffering from the coronavirus. How can you talk a bit about that? How has a breakthrough or at the outbreak been in Gaza?
So the outbreak in Gaza, and I really want to stress here that it's really difficult to kind of guess how things really are in Gaza and elsewhere in terms of the coronavirus, because it's depending upon a testing capacity that just often isn't there. So anytime you hear, these are X amount of cases that we have in this particular country, generally just period, but certainly in much of the Middle East, I would, preface that with it should be viewed with caution. But so far, especially given initial concerns, you always hear in the media about certainly Ariel Gold, that Gaza is one of the most dense cities in the world, which is not true, and that coronavirus is going to be exploding there as a result. But so there were initial concerns, but so far it seems that the coronavirus in Gaza, for example, has been not nearly as bad as many commentators initially thought it would be. There have been some deaths, there have been some cases, but thus far it's a much better picture than I think people predicted 4 to 6 weeks ago. And in part, as I noted in my talk, that's because of the extensive cooperation that Israel has given to Palestinians, whether they're in the West Bank or in Gaza. So I think that that's something that should be acknowledged, and as we note here at CAMERA, often isn't.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now from Ezra Loeb, will the next Israeli Minister of Health be a professional as opposed to a politician? I'm guessing he's talking about a health professional.
Right. That I can't say. There's many things that I am willing to hedge a guess on, but Israeli politics, generally speaking, is not one of them. I think that you might see a move in many countries for that to be the case. Of course, even at the WHO, their Secretary General is not an MD. So there might be a push in Israel and elsewhere for positions like that to be filled by people that have a more specific background. But I should note that, who knows? It is politics and it is Israel. So, yeah.
Okay, now this one is, how effective has Israel been in combating the spread of COVID in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods? as opposed, I guess, to the U.S. ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods?
That's a great question. By comparison, say to Orthodox neighborhoods in Brooklyn, for example, Israel has been much more successful in terms of containing the spread, having less fatalities, and that again is another thing that I think that I would not have predicted 4 to 6 weeks ago when I had my last talk about the coronavirus situation in Israel. Israel has managed to very successfully cordon off hotspots and to work. There have been hiccups, there have been issues, there have been a couple instances of individuals not complying or individuals being sent to hotels where they had TVs and all sorts of other expected issues. But by and large, the fatality and spread has been much less than initially predicted in many of these neighborhoods, which is an impressive feat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, the next one you sort of talked about was, do you think Israel will allow foreigners anytime soon? I guess that's a little bit hard to know, right?
It's hard to know. I think it'll depend on where they're from. And of course, it'll depend on, how soon we get a vaccine out, all these other factors. But if a vaccine takes a while, I think that we're looking at international travel being very, very different from what it is, what we're used to.
Mm-hmm.
Just period, whether it's Israel or elsewhere.
The next one is, what is the best way for Americans to support Israel? I'm guessing this relates now specifically regarding the COVID epidemic.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. One thing I want to stress is CAMERA has tremendous resources on our website, www.camera.org. Is just a wealth of information. So if you're looking to get the facts and be able to refute haters and naysayers, there's no better place. I think that it's important to understand that every country has its flaws, and no country's perfect. But much of the criticism that is aimed at Israel, be it from the coronavirus or other things, is reflective of a double standard that doesn't exist for any other country. You'll see these common things. So for example, with the Gaza Strip, and it's being so dense, and Israel has this blockade, and they're not letting medical supplies in. And this is commonly bandied about in the media. The Washington Post, New York Times, The Guardian in the UK, they'll propagate this, and it's completely false. And it's just always the same thing. And it's almost so predictable that you could have looked at this 2 months ago when things were really looking dire, and you could have said, okay, well, they're definitely going to say Israel's not allowing medical supplies into Gaza, and all these Palestinians are going to die, and Israel killed them effectively. So what the other side has, and when I say the other side, I mean those who seek to delegitimize Israel and hold it to another standard, is they don't have facts. All they have is a narrative. And that narrative is that Israel is awful, it's uniquely evil, and we're going to hold it to a different standard. And as what we at CAMERA do is we have the facts. So I think that's one thing you can do is get involved with CAMERA. It really is, I say this as someone that's based in DC, that's worked at other think tanks and elsewhere. It's a respected organization, and it's one that is nonpartisan, and I think that really helps a lot. We've got a mission, and that's purely getting the truth.
Thank you very much. That was a great answer. Next question is, does Israel have adequate testing ability?
Ooh. So I think Israel, in terms of testing capacity, has been better than many other countries. But no, I don't think so. I don't think that there's any single country that I could say, having looked at this, has adequate testing capacity. I think virtually all of them don't. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And in part, it has to do with some of the materials that you need for testing, and China hoarding those supplies as early as January. But I don't think that almost any country has the testing capacity that they really need. And that would include Israel. I think Israel's in a better position as far as testing goes than many other countries in, say, the West, including the United States, in terms of per capita testing, but it's still not really where it needs to be.
Yeah. Now, our next one is from Abi Schildkraut. So what has happened historically with terrorism in times of other stresses, for example, pandemics or natural disasters?
That's a fantastic question. So we're seeing historically terrorist groups and terrorist states. When I say terrorist states, I mean those states that are state sponsors of terrorism, like the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are very ideological, and they don't think the way that we do here in the West, in the United States, or the way they do in Israel. So they're committed to their cause of jihad and Israel's destruction, and that commitment doesn't change. Now, their capacity to carry out that commitment might. What we've seen has varied. So right now, for example, Iran is withdrawing significant forces, including Hezbollah, from Syria on Israel's borders. So that's a promising development. I think there's a variety of different reasons for that. But conversely, ISIS has reemerged in parts of Iraq with significant force, and the attacks have had an uptick. So I think it is a kind of a case-by-case basis. You've seen Hamas has still launched rockets at Israel, even while Israel gives it aid. The Palestinian Authority continues its two-faced game of taking aid and taking Israeli money while simultaneously doling out dollars to those who murder Israelis. So I think the commitment on the part of terrorists and terrorist states has not changed, but in some cases the capacity to carry out their aims and objectives has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. This next one's interesting. Is it true that the Mossad has been involved in helping manage the crisis?
Yes. Yes. And of course, as with many things, we won't have the full story on that for years to come, if ever. But it seems that Israel, that the Mossad was used and deployed to not only gather intelligence about the coronavirus, but intelligence about testing kits, personal protective equipment, where it's located, and all sorts of other things. All the full resources of the Israeli government, to include the Mossad, the Shin Bet, Amman, and all these other intelligence agencies, have absolutely been deployed. Israel, like I would argue, several other countries, including maybe to a lesser extent the United States, is on what is effectively a war footing. So the Mossad has absolutely been used in this crisis, and I think it'll be interesting years from now when we find out exactly what.
This one sort of relates. Yeah, so has the COVID weakened the Iranian regime?
That's a fantastic question. Yes. Yes. The Iranian regime right now is on its heels. They're in a very, very dire straits between the fall of oil, the death in January of Qasem Soleimani, the head of their Quds force, and their overstretch from imperial overreach. Iran, it should be noted and always remembered, is an imperialist country. They seek hegemony in the Middle East, and they have tried to effect basically an Iranian empire in the Middle East. So they're overstretched. Their money is running out. The sanctions that the U.S. has implemented have been tremendously successful. And to have all that be the background situation as it was, I think prior to COVID-19, I would say that the Iranian regime is very weakened. The COVID-19 has just pushed it over the edge. You have a variety of very upset Iranians at how Iran has handled this crisis, which has been atrocious. The Iranian regime knew that there was a spreading virus and forced its people to the streets for protests, not only over Soleimani's death, but for fake elections. And they've covered up, we know this with certainty, they've covered up, just like China has, the amount of deaths from COVID-19. So I think you have your average Iranian individual and citizen is very upset with the theocracy that they live under. And that was the case before COVID-19. I think it's absolutely the case now. The regime is definitely weakened.
Mm-hmm. Someone just posted a follow-up to that. Do we think that we could potentially see a regime change in Iran due to this crisis?
That's a really good question. On the one hand, Iran is a police state, and they have the Basij, they have, of course, Hezbollah, they have the Quds force. They are an absolute police state that is unafraid to quash any bit of dissent, and they do it regularly and tragically. But at the same time, there is a history of regime change in Iran. Not just the 1979 Islamic Revolution, but there are numerous instances when one reads Iranian or Persian history of what are effectively regime changes, revolts, and inner turmoil. So I think that possibility exists. I think that I would hope that the U.S. and others are planning for that possibility, because it's quite possible. But that being said, these are very committed ideologues. They have iron fists, and they have no compunction about brutalizing their own people to maintain their hold on power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that it's possible that this outbreak could have been prevented by lifting sanctions? Because that's what some activists have suggested.
That's a great question, and no. The United States has offered medical assistance to Iran, which declined it. And importantly, and this should be noted, that the regime itself in Iran doesn't, the sanctions that we have against them does not include medical equipment or the ability to counteract coronavirus. So I think that what you see are active campaigns on the part of pro-regime forces in the West to loosen sanctions against Iran under the false pretense that the U.S. and others, these sanctions are preventing medical aid from reaching the country. And that's just not true. And importantly as well, the regime is kleptocratic. They launched increased their space capabilities. They've increased their missile capabilities. They're still out there plotting terrorist attacks. They recently did a hack in Israel, trying to hack into Israeli governmental computers and whatnot. So I think that you see that the regime is still very, very committed. And they're choosing, of course, not to spend their money on helping their people combat coronavirus, but they're choosing it on terror. And I think there is an analogy there. When you look, for example, at the final year of World War II, Hitler very well could have deployed more assets on the Eastern Front to combat the Soviets, or on the Western Front to combat the Americans and the British. But many of these assets were kept alive to murder Jews, to carry out the Holocaust. And that's because Hitler was a committed ideologue and an anti-Semite. And the same can be said of the ruling regime in Iran. They're committed ideologues, and they have no interest in really helping their people, who are nothing but cannon fodder to them.
Mm-hmm. Next, has the Shin Bet been tracking phone connections?
So this has been a matter of contention. The Shin Bet offered to do this and put forward a plan. There was an uproar, unsurprisingly, in Israel, which is always pretty civil libertarian minded, to make sure that this is overseen by Knesset committees and had certain measures and restrictions on it. Eventually, as things stand now, no, though there was levels of contact tracing that was being done in Israel that I don't think would, for example, be possible in the United States, such as for a period of time there, if you were known to be, and they figured out that you were in contact with an individual who was positive with COVID-19, you would get a text saying, please isolate for 14 days, you've had contact with somebody. So there were certain measures that were enacted, but I think that there was a considerable uproar and concern about Shin Bet tracking phones and so on, and to use monitoring devices like that.
Mm-hmm. The next question sort of touches on that. So is there a cultural difference between Israel and the US on the privacy concerns about contact tracing through technology?
Great question. Yes. Yes, in my judgment, there absolutely is. If you're Israeli, of course, you have to serve, whether it's in the IDF, border police, or what have you. There's more of a sense of shared communal sacrifice, I think. And if you're an Israeli, it's not unlikely that you've been in war, that you've seen combat, or that you know people that have seen combat. In fact, it's quite likely. And that just is not the case with the US. There is not that sort of sense of shared communal sacrifice and concern of that type and of that nature. So I think that the historic traditions of the United States in terms of privacy and civil liberties are quite different from many places throughout the world. including other liberal democracies, whether they're in Israel or whether they're in Europe.
Mhm. Okay, next is, do we think that the newly formed Israeli coalition will be able to endure a post-COVID situation?
Oh boy. So that would be predicting the future, which I'm reluctant to do. I think that we can look at this is not the first time that Israel has had a government sharing. Far from it. In fact, of course, most famously, perhaps in the mid 1980s, you had Yitzhak Shamir and others sharing a government with Shimon Peres. So I think that there's a recognition that there is tremendous challenges that COVID-19 has put forth that are going to need to be addressed. Whether the leaders and circumstances will permit that to happen in a fashion that it should, we'll see. We'll see. I think it's encouraging so far. Certainly, I'm not Israeli, but I would not have wanted to vote in another election. I think for many of the Israelis that I know, there was kind of a sense of frustration. So I think that at the very least, you've got a shared government. You're going to have 18 months of Bibi, then you get Gantz, and we'll see how things proceed.
Now, this one is about what is the situation with Israeli soldiers in the IDF? I had heard they've been confined to their bases until today.
So generally, that's true. In certain situations, that of course can't always happen. But yes, this is a concern not just within Israel but with elsewhere. We saw that with Theodore Roosevelt, the Navy ship, for example, which had a crisis, the U.S. Navy ship. So, looking at the history of pandemics, and of course, the famous and most ominous one, perhaps in modern history, is that of the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1922. Military can act because you're living in close quarters, and just the circumstances in which you reside could result in a spreading of viruses that's quite significant. So I think there's been a major concern in Israel and elsewhere about making sure that you can simultaneously maintain military readiness and capability while, not falling prey to the coronavirus, or at least limiting the spread of the coronavirus amongst military personnel.
Okay. Okay, there's no more questions posted, but I have a couple. So I have a quote from Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement, that says, BDS and anti-normalization are the most important strategies to fight against the deal of the century, even in the time of COVID-19. But he also says, if you use medical equipment from Israel, it's not a problem. Cooperating with Israel against the virus to begin with is not considered normalization. What do you make of this?
I think I'm glad you brought that up, Ben, because that is a really important thing to understand. And this, of course, this sort of hypocrisy, which is endemic to BDS, it's part and parcel of BDS, is also endemic to Palestinian leadership. Tragically, you had Yasser Arafat saying that, well, I'm going to cooperate with the Israelis, I'll take Israeli aid and so on, but I'm okay with also paying people to murder them. So I think there's this sort of hypocrisy that you see, and it's an end game to them. It's an end game. They want BDS proponents want the destruction of the sole Jewish state, but as long as the Jewish state's around, they don't mind taking money from it or medical supplies, and they're still in their next breath, condemn it and work for its destruction. And that's just so very BDS of them.
Mm-hmm. So let's say for someone like me, or even a lot of other people here who are anti-BDS, pro-Israel advocates, how could we turn that, I guess, not against them per se, but try to use that, like the fallacies in their logic, like to show how wrong it is?
I think, you can have people, tweeting "Free Palestine" on Twitter from their iPhone, where technology is, made in Israel, that takes up the iPhone. So I think that you can highlighting hypocrisy and mockery are very effective tools. And if somebody is not a disinterested party and they are effectively partisan and somebody that is willing to manipulate the debate and they don't even really want to debate, then highlighting the facts. I mean, the facts are on Israel's side. Yeah, they are. Numerous offers for peace and statehood for Palestinians. They've all been declined. Still continuing to pay terrorists. Still publishing anti-Semitic imagery, and those are facts, and they can't be washed away, no matter how many newspapers are printed that omit those facts. And that's why CAMERA's role is essential.
Yep. Okay, I have another question, since there's still no questions posted. So at the beginning, we talked about the cooperation, especially the medical cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian doctors. How do you think that cooperation will evolve post-COVID? Do you think it's going to be like help towards a peace process, or are we going to forget about it? How is it going to work?
I think, regrettably, the Palestinian Authority has shown a willingness to take Israeli aid and money while simultaneously condemning Israel and thwarting the peace process, not being an active or real participant in a process. So I think do I think that things big picture will change? No, I don't, because the Palestinian Authority continues to tell its people that Israel doesn't have the right to exist. It's illegitimate, and they continue to incite violence against Israelis. So that's the big picture. But at the same time, I don't think that one should gloss over the fact that personal relationships do matter. And if you're working on a shared objective with somebody, relationships can develop, and it's not ever a bad thing. And famously, there are instances of Palestinian Authority security forces officials that do get along with and have good relationships with IDF counterparts. And that's important for anything, whether it's preventing terrorist attacks or what have you. But big picture, I don't expect things to move forward until the PA changes its rhetoric and its objectives.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Oh, okay, a few more questions. So not sure if we already discussed this, but what is your opinion about talks of the Jordan Valley annexation?
So I do want to stress, and this is the other thing that CAMERA brings to the table, CAMERA does not take policy positions, which is absolutely essential to our being an impartial advocate for the truth and being viewed as such by the media. So we don't take any policy positions on Israeli or U.S. policy. I think it's going to be something that's going to be very well covered in the media. And when I say well covered, I don't mean properly covered. It's important to note that there's not talk of annexation for the whole area, and it also that there is legal basis for Israel having a claim, because annexation itself implies that this is a country, just the term in a legal sense. And Eugene Kontorovich has talked about this. He's a law professor at George Mason U and an expert on international law, that you can't annex something unless it's a recognized state or nation. And there is no recognized state or nation of Palestine. But as far as the merits of such a policy itself, can't comment on that.
Makes sense. Now this is a question from Dexter Van Zyl. Did the Gaza activist getting arrested for speaking with Israelis via Zoom have an impact on the people's opinion of Hamas? I'm not sure what people he's talking about, but
great question, Dexter. I don't know. I mean, polling in Hamas or in Hamas-ruled Gaza, and as well in the PA-ruled West Bank, is kind of notorious to really gauge, because these are authoritarian regimes, and getting honest answers is not always an easy thing. I wouldn't imagine that it would have been viewed favorably by many Gazans, but I can't really say.
Okay, well, There's no more questions here. We still have a few minutes if anyone else wants to ask. Oh, wait, there is. Okay. So there are reports that Iran is pulling out of Syria. What are the chances for a direct conflict between Israel and Iran in the near future?
Great question. I think those chances are good. I don't mean good in the sense of the term, but Iran's objectives, as I said earlier, have remained unchanged. They seek the destruction of Israel and the genocide of all of its inhabitants. I think that as Iran continues, and everything indicates that they are, working to develop nuclear weapons and have the capability to use those nuclear weapons against a country whose destruction they call for routinely, I think that that makes the likelihood of an open conflict between Israel and Iran quite good. So at the moment, of course, as I said, Iran is on its heels. They are seemingly, it's still quite early, but it does seem that they are withdrawing some forces from Syria. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Partly it's because they lost Qasem Soleimani in January. I think that's a huge development. And I don't think that if Soleimani were alive today, I do not think Iran would be leaving Syria. The COVID-19 crisis is part of it. So I think that that's a promising development that has to be watched. But I think that the overall likelihood of a conflict between Iran and Israel at some point in the future is regrettably good.
Mm-hmm. This is a follow-up. Could Sean comment on how that conflict would look?
So the thing about Iran is, and I've read several excellent books on Iranian military history and capabilities and the Quds Force and so on. Iran is excellent at asymmetrical warfare. They excel at using proxy forces to carry out attacks. Their conventional capabilities, however, are not very good. The Iranian Navy is not impressive. The actual Iranian army, the Artesh, is effectively nothing. They were shattered by the regime, dating back a couple decades. So an actual conventional conflict, I think the odds would, probably favor Israel. But Iran, they have a lot of people. They invest a lot of money and time in their terror network, and they are very good at asymmetrical warfare. Very good at it. So that conflict would be very awful, and Iran would spare no expense, or its proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. Their proxies would spare no expense in using civilian shields. So with Iran leaving Syria, I think that Lebanon is still perhaps a good place for that conflict to occur, whether it's with Iran directly, which I highly doubt it would be, or with Hezbollah, which effectively controls Lebanon. I think that you would have a lot of innocent people, unfortunately, that would fall prey because the Iranian regime and its proxies use human shields.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so if no one has any more questions right now, we covered a lot. So the Facebook page is still going to be there, so you can post any questions you have there, and we'll try to get them to Sean and post the answers. So if no one has anything else right now, I'd really like to thank Sean and everyone who asked questions. Really made this a great event. And I guess stay safe for the rest of the summer or as long as this goes on.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you for everyone for joining us. It's great speaking with you guys.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too. Be safe.